this video, we are going to see the new features and the backward and compatible changes that have been introduced in PHP 8.3 starting from PHP 8.2. In order for us to execute our scripts against two versions of PHP, I have created a Docker Compose file where I define two services. The first one, PHP 8.2, will be running PHP 8.2 CLI under PHP 8.2 volume, and the second service, PHP 83, which will be running PHP 8.3 CLI under PHP 8.3 volume. Down here I have split my terminal into two. On the left hand we are going to see PHP 8.2. Let's execute this command, docker compose exec PHP 82 bash, which will be getting me into one of PHP 82.3 service container. Let's execute that. Then within we are going to cd PHP 8.2, which is the volume that we have mounted here, then src, then bc, and check out the versions that we have of PHP, which is PHP 8.2. So we are okay here on the left hand side. We are going to do the same on the right hand side with PHP 8.3. So we are going to cd PHP 8.3 src bc, and then check out the version of PHP, which will be PHP 8.3. Now that we have everything set up, let's get started with the first backward and compatible change, which is concerning the range function. In PHP 8.2, if we execute range with a string digit, we are going to have that converted into an integer, then we will be executing range into that integer. So if I execute range from 9 to A in PHP 8.2, surprisingly, we are going to have this output over here, which is a range between 9 and 0. Now, that is not the expected output. In PHP 8.3, we are going to have another output, which is the following, which is a range from the 9 as a character into the A as a character. That's the first change that have been made into range. The second change is that we have now a more clear message when we have step as 0. In PHP 8.2, if we execute this range over here, we are going to have a very generic message error saying that argument 3 step must not exceed the specified range, which is not very clear. In PHP 8.3, we are now having a very clear message saying that argument 3 cannot be 0. That's the second change made to range. The third change is that range now will throw an error if we provide an object, an array, or a resource as argument. In PHP 8.2, we are going to have a warning, then a strange behavior of range. Let's try that out. We are going to have a warning saying that an object is not really what we expect, but we are going to execute anyway, and you have a range between 1 and 0. Now in PHP 8.3, we are going to have an error instead. The error message being fatal error uncat type error, range argument 1, start must be of type string, int, or float. That's a list of changes that have been made into range. This is not the full list of changes. If you are interested in the full list of changes that have been made into range function, I'll be linking for you the full list that you can find in the PHP documentation in the description area. The second change is an improvement to date time. We have new exceptions that have been created that are more specific. Instead of having the generic exception in PHP 8.2, we now have in PHP 8.3 a more specific exceptions. Let's try that out. I'm going to create now a new date time zone with an unknown time zone. In PHP 8.2, we are going to have a generic exception saying unquote exception unknown or bad time zone. In PHP 8.3, we are going to have a specific exception instead of the generic exception, which is date invalid time zone exception. Another example will be creating a new date time immutable with a format that cannot be parsed by PHP. Let's try that out in PHP 8.2. We are going to have again an exception, an instance of exception, but in PHP 8.3 we are going to have a specific exception, which is date malformed string exception. Those are two examples of the improvement that have been made into date time. This is the full list of exceptions and errors that have been added in PHP 8.3. For further details about these exceptions, I will be linking an excellent article in php.watch that will be detailing this in depth. The third change is concerning class constant declarations. it is actually a consequence for a new feature that we are going to see just in a moment, which is the introduction of types for constants. In PHP 8.2, this script will be executing with no problem. I have created a class called myFar that will be extending PHP far class. Within this far class, we are going to have a constant called none. This constant have an integer value. Now, if I give a string value for my constant in PHP 8.2, this will be executing with no problem. So if I execute this, I'm not going to have a problem whatsoever. No error message. But in PHP 8.3, if I execute this script over here, I'm going to see an error saying fatal error, type of my for none must be compatible with for none of type int. So here, this none over here is of type integer, but here we are defining the same, redefining actually the same constant with a string value, which is no longer acceptable in PHP 8.3, and we are going to see why just in a moment. That's for the backward and compatible changes. Now we are going to see the new features. The first new feature is class constant types. As we have already seen in the backward and compatible changes, we said that PHP 8.3 have introduced the ability to define types for constants. So here I can define within my interface A, for example, a constant named PHP of type string and assign to it a string value. This will be possible in PHP 8.3. Now, if I extend, for example, or implement my interface in this case and give to my constant a value other than a string, I'm going to have an error. Let's try that out. If I execute, let's first go to the other folder, which is new features. Then let's execute this script. I'm going to have an error saying that cannot use array as value for class constant foo PHP of type string. So we can now define types of constants, and we should obey to these types when we extend and redefine our constants. That's the first new feature. The second new feature is dynamic class constant fetch. Let's say that I have a class called foo. Within this foo class, I'm going to define a constant PHP. This constant will be having PHP 8.3, for example, as a string. Now, if I want to access this constant within a dynamic context, meaning that I will be defining a variable called searchable constant, for example, that will be equals PHP. And then I want to get the constant foo PHP through this variable over here. In PHP 8.2, I can use this expression over here, constant, and then pass to constant foo class combined with two colons, then the value of searchable constant. In PHP 8.3, this has got simplified with this expression over here. We can use foo simply, then two colons, and then the value of my variable, which will be equals PHP. So the var dump over here in PHP 8.2 is going to show me an error. Why? Because this syntax over here is added in PHP 8.3. Let's try that out. Let's execute this script. We're going to have a syntax error in this script in PHP 8.2, but in PHP 8.3 we are going to have the var dump of line 10 and 11, which are the same. Now let's execute this script again, and we have PHP 8.3 for both. So both those notations are equals in PHP 8.3. The third change is the introduction of a new attribute. If you are not familiar with attributes, I have done a video about that. I will be linking it in the description, and it will also be available on the suggestion area. PHP 8.3 introduced the override attribute. What this attribute will be doing is that it will be checking if this function over here, is this method format, is somewhere present in all the superclasses. For my case, for example, my datetime extends datetime, so override will be checking if the class datetime will be having a function called format. Now let's try that out by adding x, for example, to format and see if PHP will be raising an error. Now if I execute this script, I'm going to have an error saying that my date format x has override attribute, but no matching parent method exists. Now if I remove this x, I'm not going to have this error again, which is a good way to avoid me having errors or typos in my functions and thinking that I have overridden functions in the superclasses. Alright, the fourth change is concerning deep cloning read-only properties. In PHP 8.2, we have introduced read-only on classes, which means that if a class is read-only, then all its properties are going to be read-only. Now this got us into a small problem, which is when we clone a class, we are no longer able to modify its properties. Let's say that we have a post class called post, which is read-only. This class will be having a created at attribute of type datetime. If I want to clone this post, I have to define within my magic method clone a way to deep clone my created at property, which is this line over here. So if I clone a post, we are going to have a created at cloned for me as well. Now here in line 14, I'm going to create a new post with a new date time and try to clone this instance and put it in cloned variable. Say that I want to modify my created at by adding a small date interval. In PHP 8.2, this will not be possible. Let's try that out. I'm going to have an error saying cannot modify read-only property post created at because it is considered as read-only. This is problematic because we can no longer edit this property, but this got fixed in PHP 8.3. So now we can modify that without an error. I don't have an error here. Let's re-execute again for more clarity. I'm going to execute this in PHP 8.2. I'm going to get an error saying that cannot modify read-only property, but in PHP 8.3 this got fixed and I don't have an error whatsoever. That's for deep cloning read-only properties. The fifth change is the introduction of a new function, helper function called JSON validate. Say that I want to validate a JSON before trying to parse it. In PHP 8.2, I have to introduce a function. Let's say its name is JSON validate 82. This function will be parsing the string and checking if we have an error while parsing, then we have a bad format, otherwise we have a good format. In PHP 8.3, a more elegant way is to use this new function JSON validate that will be taking a string and then returning true or false depending on the value. Let's try this script in PHP 8.2. If I execute this script over here, I'm going to have an error saying that this function JSON validate is not present, and that does make sense. Why? Because this function is introduced in PHP 8.3. So here I have call to undefined function JSON validate. Now in PHP 8.3, I'm going to have an output saying true, which means that this string over here is a valid JSON format. Let's introduce an error. Instead of having a colon, let's have a semicolon and see if we have false, and yes, we do have false, which means that this function is validating for us the JSON that we provided as argument. The sixth change is a more elegant way to randomize things in PHP. Before PHP 8.3, we had the rand function that randomizes things for us. Now we have a more elegant way to do that with this randomizer class. Let's say, for example, that I want to get a random string from this string over here, a random 5 elements from this string. I can do that by randomizer get bytes from string and then display that. Let's try this script out in PHP 8.3. And we do have now a random string generated in this placeholder over here, concatenated with example.com. For full list of randomizer API, I'm going to link the documentation in the description area. The last change is concerning the PHP command line. In PHP 8.2 and lower, we don't have the ability to lint with PHP-L multiple files. We have only the possibility to lint a single file, and even if you provide multiple files, only the first one will be considered. So if I lint, for example, in my case, if I lint my first and second files over here under BC folder with PHP-L in PHP 8.2, I'm going to have only no syntax error detected in BC1 range functions PHP, which is the first argument. Now in PHP 8.3, let's copy the exact same command over here in PHP 8.3, and I'm going to have both files considered for the PHP-L. So now PHP-L is taking variadic arguments, which means that we can provide as many arguments as we can, and they are all going to be considered in the linting process. That's it for this video. Thank you for watching. I will be asking questions as usual by the end of this video to help you stick some information that you have already seen together.